Today, I'm going to continue my Lenten sermon series with the title, Supper with Jesus. A few moments ago, we listened to Jeannie Stocks read from the 10th chapter, verses 38 to 42, the very familiar story of Jesus having supper, if you like, with Mary and Martha, two sisters, in this little village of Bethany. Now, let me say at the very beginning, I know that this story annoys a lot of women. I can well remember driving home from church with my mother, my father driving, and my mother fussing and fuming. She did not like the sermons that were preached about Mary and Martha. She did not like the notion that Martha slaved away in the kitchen, got Jesus' criticism, and Mary, who didn't lift a little finger, got all the criticism, it seems, from Jesus. And she wasn't alone. I served in one church where one unit of the UCW felt about the same way about that text as my mother. They're all busy, hardworking members. And so they named their UCW unit the Marthas. I think that's all understandable. But here's the thing. The story of Mary and Martha is a lot like an iceberg. What we heard Jeannie read this morning tells us about 10% of what we can see. 90% of this story is really hidden below the surface in what was going on in the church at the time Luke wrote his gospel. And we who live in our modern culture have to admit we can't see it because our culture is so radically different from biblical culture. So I'd like to explore this story in Luke's gospel from the almost always ignored and forgotten 90% that is below the surface. And I'm going to begin by talking about Martha in the story. You'll recall that the storyteller Luke mentions that Martha opened her home to Jesus. That in itself is just loaded, absolutely loaded. It's loaded because Martha was a very unusual woman for her time and place. It means she was independent. It means she was financially stable. And that, in biblical culture, was a rare thing. It's interesting that the gospel writer Luke never mentions a man in the house. There's no mention of the head of the household as male, which usually he was. Martha owns and manages her own home. Very rare for those times. Also, while it was quite acceptable for women to do all the preparation and serving and cooking and cleaning up, all the hard lifting of a meal, Martha's invitation to Jesus also pushed against the social, the cultural, and the religious boundaries of first century Galilee and Judea. That was a radical thing for a woman to do, to invite a male and his disciples to share a meal in her home. And Jesus' acceptance of her invitation was no less radical. And what was even more radical is a male having a conversation or entertaining or being entertained by women. And what was taboo, what was absolutely taboo, was talking about God with women. What was also taboo, while women could help do the hard work of the cleaning up and the serving and the preparations, they could not sit at table with men. So what Luke is telling us here in the context of first century Judaism is the actions of Mary and Martha and Jesus in biblical culture were subversive and radical. And as radical, Jesus' presence there is radical for another reason. Because Jesus is promoting a vision, or at least a foretaste of egalitarianism. He's promoting by his presence there about the equality between women and men. He is, by his presence there, declaring to the world the difficult to digest truth at that time that women, these women, Mary and Martha, indeed all women, have a right equal to any man's to learn and to teach. Back to Martha. Martha demonstrates hospitality by welcoming Jesus into her home, and then she busies herself with all the things women traditionally did, things that are socially sanctioned by that society. She's striving to do the best she can to look after her honored guests. Luke doesn't really come right out and tell us what kept her so busy, but Elizabeth Johnson, a commentator and theologian, says she was probably preparing the meal. And according to the biblical contemporary Palestinian biblical scholar Naveen Saras, is that how you say it? I got it right. According to Naveen Haras, what Martha was doing was overseeing the material care of her guests. She was making Jesus feel part of her family circle. She was sharing, again, a quote, the sacredness of family space with Jesus. Meanwhile, while Martha was so busy, Mary is sitting at the feet of Jesus, listening to what he has to say. She totally neglects, doesn't lift a finger to help Martha at all. She does not assume the expected role of women in her society. Instead, she assumes a different role. She sits at the feet of a rabbi, listening and learning something back then that was reserved pretty much for men only. Mary learning from the teacher Jesus is another instance of female followers of Jesus, female disciples, pushing against very real cultural, social, and religious boundaries. Another radical act. Now, up till now, as Jeannie was reading it, it sounds like a pretty pleasant story. And then it takes a hard turn, a sharp and nasty turn. Martha is preoccupied with the cooking, but she, at the same time, is really annoyed with Mary not lifting a finger to help her. She's getting tired. She's getting grumpy. She's burdened by all these onerous household tasks. And so she comes up and she says to Jesus, I want to get you involved in this family feud. Don't you care that my sister has left me all alone to do the household tasks? Tell her to help me. Jesus replied, Martha, Martha, you're anxious and upset about many things, but only a few things are necessary. Really, only one. Mary has chosen the better part. She's not going to be deprived of that. Well, what in the world are we to make of that story, especially 4 days after International Women's Day? Now, many who read this story cheer, quite rightly, cheer for Mary in her inversion, her intentional inversion of gender and household roles. And as I mentioned at the beginning of this morning's remarks, many people, like my mother and like that particular UCW unit named the Marthas, empathize with Martha's resentment of Mary because she left her all alone to do the work. And then we look at Jesus' response. He hardly seems empathetic or understanding of Martha. He chides her. Actually, he rebukes her, it seems. Tells her not to be distracted, not to be anxious, not to get upset. Then he tells Mary, true and gracious hospitality requires only one thing, and that's to pay attention to your guests. It seems that Jesus values Mary's choice of listening over Martha's choice of serving, doesn't it? But that interpretation of Luke's gospel hardly makes sense. It doesn't make sense because over and over again in the Gospels, we can read where Jesus commends kind and loving, compassionate, and active service to everyone, to friends and neighbors and strangers. So what in the world's going on here? So I want to go back to what I said before. To answer this question, we have to remember what was going on in Luke's church. We have to remember that we only see 10% of the story. We have to understand what was happening in Luke's church. So I want you to dive below the surface with me, and we'll take a look. Luke is talking about what is happening in the church at that time. Luke is intentionally using Mary and Martha as symbols, as representatives of two different groups in his church, two different ministries, if you like. On the one hand, Martha represents the ministry of actively serving others. Serving others both within the church and the wider community. Martha, for Luke, symbolizes a group in the early church that gets really busy doing things for other people, doing good deeds. People who go out of their way to serve others within the church, to give them food. And I mentioned earlier that in the city of Rome itself, Christians fed over 10,000 widows and orphans in the early church. Martha's group gave nursing care for those infected by plague. They reached out to the lame and the blind. They rescued the perishing, that sort of thing. They looked also to the needs of the church itself. On the other hand, Mary represents, for Luke, the group or the ministry within the early church that focuses on the Word. And by the Word, I mean they study the teachings of Jesus. They focus on prayer, the singing of hymns, meditation, music, liturgy, the study of scriptures, public worship. They focus on quiet and thoughtful reflection. Theirs is not an active ministry. They're on a quest to understand their faith. And if we read this story carefully, you'll see that Jesus does not prefer one group over the other. The ministry or group represented by Martha, the ministry of actively serving others and serving the needs of the church, Luke is saying, must be built on what Mary is doing. It must the first and greatest priority is to understand why you're doing that service in the church and in the community. In other words, first comes an understanding of God revealed through Jesus Christ. And out of that comes our service. Well, what does that mean for us gathered here today? It means that for church members today, we have to be, to some degree, like Mary. We have to prioritize worship, thoughtful reflection, meditation, Bible study, worship, prayer, celebration, and so on. For that is the very foundation of who we are as followers and disciples of Jesus. It also means that we're called by God to be like Martha. We're called to serve others in real ways and tangible ways, that we must provide for the needs of the oppressed and the marginalized. It means we first sit at Jesus' feet and learn what we're all about, and then we go into the world and do what Jesus would have us to do. We don't become like Martha, so caught up and doing and so busy that we forget our reasons for doing what we're doing in the first place. No wonder Jesus said, when you get caught up in doing and you forget the reason that you're doing it, you become anxious, you become distracted, you lose your focus, you lose your bearings. You know, if we don't remember the reason we're serving others is God revealed through Jesus, then there's no difference between us and the Lions Club or the Rotary Club, good organizations, but God has no priority in them or any others like them. In some social groups, God has no standing whatsoever. In short, like Mary in this morning's gospel, we must never lose sight of the spiritual fact that the God of Jesus, the God who is pure, loving compassion, the one who motivates us to be compassionate and to compassionately love and serve others, comes first. And we build upon that, our outreach to others. A sort of bottom line, I came up with this for disciples of Jesus in Luke's time and ours. The ministry of the word, worship, study, and prayer, and the ministry of serving each other people require each other. They're symbiotic. They're dependent on each other. Amen.